So Joe, how did we let this happen? And how have so many municipalities for so long not seen this?
Um, I've gotten a lot of folks say to me, they're like, "That seems so simple,"
Yeah.
like, and it is. But my reaction is usually, how long did it take us to create a Post-it note? It's paper, it's glue, or put wheels on luggage. How many times hundreds of years we walked around with luggage before we put wheels on it? So, I think that in a way, we've accepted this as a normal part of what cities are, and we just haven't been conscious to it. So I think the recession for us gave us the ability to start looking at it, and I think it resonates with communities.
I mean, one of the things you mentioned to me last night, and we heard it again this morning, we tend to talk about our infrastructure as assets as opposed to liabilities. So talk a bit about why is a street actually a liability and not an asset?
That's actually, it was brought up in the morning conversation.
Yeah.
He talked about the infrastructure assets.
That's right.
There's standards that people adopt. Like when I first started working in planning, it was a standard to have 2.5 parking spaces per residential unit. It was a standard, no one questioned it, until we did question it and looked at data and realized that didn't make sense. In Asheville, we don't have any parking requirements in our downtown, none. But the asset thing, cities, when they run their ledgers, they actually list their streets, pipes, whatever, as assets. We're working in Lafayette, Louisiana, and we asked them, we said, can you take that out in the marketplace and sell it? Can I take your asset, like my house or my car, and put it in the marketplace? Yes. Can I take a pipe? No. And it's just, again, it's a standard that's been in the system that needs to change.
And the implications of that, of course, is cities may think they're richer than they really are.
Oh, yeah.
I mean that.
Well, they don't realize it's a maintenance item that you have, it's really a liability. It's a cost that you have to maintain over time.
Right, yeah. Other questions from the audience? I found your talk very provocative, and I mean, really, what I find fascinating about the stories you tell using maps, which strike me as getting at these issues in ways that are very compelling to the public, which must be powerful when you work with these cities. So, questions? Anybody want to? Up right here, Paul. Wait for the.
Thanks very much, Joe. I appreciate the presentation. I've heard it a couple of times, and I think you've continued to enrich it, and I do appreciate that. You touched on something toward the end that is one that I've kind of puzzled with myself in local practice, and that's the role of the assessor. Politicians trust assessors. They believe there's a science there. They believe that they're getting the kind of assessments they need. And as you've worked with some of them, it seems to me that if there's a group out there, if there's a profession out there that doesn't get it, it's that profession. What are your thoughts about turning that key group around on this so they start valuing things properly, which will, I think, cause more, not just politicians, but people who are engaged in a variety of ways in civic endeavors, whether it's Rotarians, you name it, to kind of wake up about some of this?
Well, first, I don't think the assessors are, I wouldn't say they don't get it. They get it, but they're trapped in a really weird system. You're setting value. Think of what an abstract notion that is. And I would go further to say what really needs to be questioned is, why do we tax on value? I'm trained as an architect. You're trained as an architect. There's a perverse disincentive to build value. Why should I do it? It's going to cost me more, and then I'm going to get taxed more. So it's actually more beneficial to me, based on this current standard that we have in taxation, to build a cheap throwaway building in your community. So if we just put value aside for a second and say, why don't we tax on cost? What does it cost for the community to service my real estate? And then that's my starting point of my taxation. So I wouldn't, the assessors are unfortunately trapped in a strange little universe that was created in the 1700s. In England, you were taxed on the number of windows you had for 100 years in the 1700s. So people started boarding up the windows to avoid paying taxes. They threw that tax system out. there are actually people inside the assessors community that get it. Their magazine, like in planning, our magazine is called Planning. Their magazine is called Fair and Equitable. That they realize the system is unfair and inequitable, but they're trapped in that box until national and state policy changes.
So how would we change that? I mean, how do we get that?
It's been something that's been talked about for hundreds of years. There's a tax economist, his name was Henry George. In the 1800s, he talked about getting rid of value altogether and just taxing you based on proximity, which is more fair of a tax system. It started a movement in the 1800s called Georgism, and one of my favorite. Have y'all ever heard of Henry George? A few people. Henry George started a movement, and one of his devotees created a board game because she realized adults don't get it, but if I could just develop a board game that children would understand land valuation. That board game's called Monopoly. We all understand land value taxation. It's proximity, land assembly, and putting buildings on it. That's how you win the game. But we don't practice that in our cities. And I think it's because we think it's too complicated to change. But there are policies.
Yeah. Do we have a question over? Okay.
Yes. So I worked in Harris County Appraisal District before Maricopa, so doing assessment. And so one of the things that assessors have is mass appraisal, but yet they look at individual properties. So in reality, you're not really doing mass appraisal if you're looking at individual properties to do value instead of looking at the whole neighborhood and say, okay, if these are the criterias for the neighborhood, whether it got high crime, good school district, close to good transportation, then the values go according to these criteria. Now, if you happen to have a leaky roof, you get a discount if you can prove that your roof is leaky. But it doesn't go that way, so a lot of times when they do those numbers, that's why you'll see some properties higher. My next door neighbor, if he protests, he'll get a lower value than the exact same house I have. But
Yeah,
I didn't protest.
Well, actually, what's funny is just for giggles, and my wife thinks I'm a little weird for this, but I protested the land value of my house because my neighbor across the street was half the value of mine. And I lost because my neighbor across the street has a double lot. I lost ironically to the more land, less value rule. What I'm showing, the CAMA model, if you're familiar with it. Who's read the CAMA model? We've got one person over here. Anyone? If you want to know the system, we're essentially, as geodesigners, we're illiterate in the entire cash flow system that operates our country. It's called the CAMA model, and it's all of these decisions. It's hard to be an assessor. You've got, 500,000 parcels of data. You can't go to everybody's house and do it. You run a mathematical model and just hope for the best. It's a very inaccurate science. And it's just this, hopefully you get enough money at the end of the day to pay for all your bills inside the government. This same presentation I did at the North Carolina Municipal Budget Officers Conference. These are all the bean counters, the finance officers of cities, and they had never looked at the CAMA model before. So it's crazy to me, all of these silos that are separated that don't speak to each other, but they really do.
Do we have maybe one more question? Paul?
Yeah, in Florida, I asked that same question once that you did. Why more land and you pay less tax on it? And the property appraiser said, well, in the agricultural lands, you can have 200 acres, have one house. You really don't get more fire. You really don't get more of those services that are required. So the agricultural lands actually require less services. And then the next question that I asked him was, well, then why do developers keep the land in agriculture? And the answer was, well, they can drain the wetlands. They can do all this stuff for agriculture that you really can't do for development. So the real question on this thing is that I think, his explanation to me was, I think about the large land issue you were talking about is a remnant of all this agricultural stuff that really has come about.
Well, in most states, in Florida in particular, you all have an agricultural exemption. So that theory is out the window because you have a separate policy that gets the farmers a get out of jail free card anyway. If you just have, I think it was 10 cows on the property, it's considered a farm. So, there's a lot of theory behind all of this stuff, but it's an attempt of rationalizing a system that's inherently irrational. And it's funny, at the assessors conference, I sat through the Walmart executives of real estate presentation, and he got up there and talked about how cheap his buildings are to all of the assessors across the entire country. It was brilliant. And what we see in all of our studies is their Walmarts are almost exactly the same value. So he just went straight to the source and said, I want to pay as little taxes in your communities, give me a low tax bill. And they all did it. It's brilliant. But he's playing the game. He's playing the game very well. If we just allow ourselves to let the market show us where the inaccuracies and the imprecisenesses in our mathematical model, they'll show us where the inefficiencies are. But we don't have to keep it that way. We can plug those gaps.
Yeah, I agree. The other one, the same thing you were just talking about. Developers often have 24 square miles of land. And in examples in Florida, and I won't say exactly where, a person will put a buffalo on
Yeah.
there. They get the agricultural exemption
Yeah.
for the 24.
But again, it's form follows finance.
Yeah.
If we just look at the form, it's going to tell us what the finance model is. Go the next step further, you're going to see the policies that created that. And we just can't be afraid of that. Let's change the tax code. Incidentally, one of our jokes is I made a street art sticker of the count saying do the math. And for this presentation, we made a jack that says do the map on it, and an Ian McHarg. And we went so far as to do a Jon Snow and the Jon Snow's pump. So if y'all want some, Josh has a box of stickers here. Feel free to take them.
Great. Well, we can pick those up at the break, which it's time for. So what? Oh, well, Carl. Okay, Carl, sorry.
Joe, have you ever considered reverse engineering your analysis model and designing a city by designing a tax code?
Well, it's funny you should, yes, is the short answer. Josh and I are actually working with Charles Marone. For those of you, Strong Towns out of Minnesota. Chuck's awesome. He's a civil engineer that talks about the cost of roads and infrastructure and wanting to pair that with land use. So we're kind of like chocolate and peanut butter together. We do revenue, he does cost. And we're working with Lafayette. The parish owns the water, sewer, electric utility, cable company, telephone company. They own the whole thing. And so we're going into their model and coming up with a cost and a revenue model in 3D to see how it works. And then that's going to inform the policies that are in action there. So we don't know where it's going, but it could be a cool thing.
Great, good. Well, time for a break. Thank you, Joe. This was terrific. Yeah, yeah, this was great.